State of the Nation tonight. The COVID inquiry's clash with the Cabinet Office has reached its denouement. The Cabinet Office did not hand over its WhatsApps and is instead taking its own inquiry to court. But above all else, what is clear is that the inquiry has become a complete circus and is taking much too long. It needs to start from scratch. Labour councillors in Salford have come under fire for taking the controversial Black Lives Matter knee at the third anniversary of George Floyd's murder. What has this anything to do with the local politics of Salford isn't entirely clear. I'll be borrowing from Dominic Raab's wise words, who once said that he'd only ever kneel for his sovereign and, of course, his wife. Now, an example of lèse-majesté has emerged in a portrait of our sovereign lord the King. The British Embassy in the United Arab Emirates has commissioned a painting of His Majesty for the royal family of Dubai, and they have some serious explaining to do, as you can see from the migraine-inducing mess on your screens now. And we'll be batting our way through today's events at Lord's as we took on Ireland on the first day of the first Test match. So far, the players have escaped unscathed by the eco-maniacs, but they did cause them to be momentarily delayed. We'll be joined by England legend Pat Pocock for a run-through of the day's events. And finally, don't forget, it's our weekly award ceremony, Wet Wipe of the Week. Don't forget to send in your nominations. The results will be in soon. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by our trenchant panel today, journalist and former Conservative councillor Caroline Fisk and contributing editor to the socialist Novara Media, Michael Walker. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, what you've all been waiting for, the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story tonight, as you've been hearing, is that Boris Johnson has repeated his insistence that the COVID inquiry should be able to see all of his unredacted messages in their fullest form. In his own letter to the inquiry this evening, he's offered to hand over the requested material himself directly. The Cabinet Office today began legal action in a bid to challenge the inquiry's order for the release of the former Prime Minister's messages and diaries. And earlier today, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said the government was confident in its position, responding to the COVID inquiry's demand. Officials, though, ignored a 4 o'clock deadline today to disclose the messages. Labour has received a formal complaint over the conduct of the MP Geraint Davis. He was suspended by the party pending an investigation into reports of incredibly serious allegations of completely unacceptable behaviour. The Swansea West MP has had the whip removed while a review is carried out. Earlier, he said he didn't recognise the claims, but apologised if he had inadvertently offended anyone. In Bournemouth tonight, local media have been reporting a large fight breaking out on the beach near to Bournemouth Pier today, just a day after 2 children drowned. A 12-year-old girl from Buckinghamshire and a 17-year-old boy from Southampton died after being pulled from the water yesterday afternoon. A police investigation has been launched. 8 others were treated for non-threatening injuries, and a man in his 40s, who the force say was on the water at the time, has been arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. The average house price fell by around £1,000 in April after 3 months of consecutive increases. That's according to the Halifax, which says the typical property value fell by 0.3% month on month. That takes the average UK house price to £286,000 for the month of April. Just Stop Oil protesters blocked the England cricket team today and its bus as it made its way to Lord's. They stood in front of the coach this morning in the middle of the road, preventing the team from getting to the ground on time. Cricketer Johnny Bairstow posted a photograph on social media saying, "If we're a bit late, it's not our fault." They did arrive safely, though, at Lord's, where day 1 of the Test match between England and Ireland got underway. And lastly, the Prince and Princess of Wales made a surprise visit to Jordan today to attend the wedding of the country's crown prince. William and Kate are among a host of foreign royalty attending the nuptials of Prince Hussein and his Saudi Arabian wife. The celebrations were held at the Zahran Palace, the same venue chosen by the Crown Prince's father, King Abdullah II. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and the TuneIn app. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Sweden has finished its COVID inquiry. Ours has barely begun. If it were done when 'tis done, 'twere well it were done quickly. But today there's been the synthetic row about WhatsApp messages between the Cabinet Office and the COVID inquiry. Now it seems the government will be taking its own inquiry to court. As you know, I'm often willing to criticise the government when it's wrong, but on this occasion, it's right. If they get this enormous quantity of information, the chairman of the inquiry, Lady Hallett, will drown in trivia and her report will not be completed in time for the next pandemic. Lady Hallett has asked for every WhatsApp message, but the government won't provide that which is unambiguously irrelevant. And the government's right. Read the Act. Section 21 of the 2005 Inquiries Act says the chairman of inquiry may by notice require a person, quote, to produce any documents in his custody or under his control that relate to the matter in question at the inquiry. The chairman is not entitled to go on a general fishing expedition, which wouldn't be in the interests of the inquiry, which needs to be moved in a timely manner. Indeed, a timely manner is one of the terms of reference of the inquiry itself that the chairman is obliged to follow. What we need to know from the inquiry is straightforward. Were the lockdowns necessary and proportionate? Why was the vaccine rollout so successful? There's a good model for inquiries. We've done it before. Andrew Tyree did an inquiry into the banking crisis. He did it as a parliamentary inquiry. He even had the Archbishop of Canterbury on the panel. And it was done within a couple of years, costing a few millions of pounds rather than into the hundreds of millions that this inquiry is costing. And its suggestions were quickly put into place to make our financial systems more secure. We need to make sure that this inquiry is done in a timely and efficient way and look at other countries. But we also need to move away from the obsession with COVID, because malicious and officious prosecutions of technical lockdown breaches are still going on in secret courts, which is not good for British justice. It emerged today that a key worker, Mr. Kevin Brown, who worked as a technician keeping the power on during the pandemic, has been fined over £2,000 for a trivial lockdown breach that took place 2 years ago, and more cases are still currently going through our courts. But there's a backlog in the courts. They're years behind with serious cases. Why are they faffing around with trivial lockdown COVID-related cases? We need a swift inquiry, swift answers, and we need to be thinking about the future, not endlessly harking on about the past. But of course, as always, I want to know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm now delighted to be joined by Raymond Newell, the co-author of Johnson at Number 10. Raymond, thank you very much for joining me. Boris has said he'll hand over anything that they want, which from his point of view seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. But surely in the interests of the inquiry, it should only be asking for that which is relevant.
Thank you for having me on, Jacob. No, I think it's quite right that Johnson's agreed to disclose at least the messages from May 2021 onwards, when he got his new phone. The old one, of course, with security issues after his number was leaked. But you're quite right that the inquiry needs to be careful with how it uses evidence here. There will be so much detail in those messages. There will be an absolute wealth of it. The inquiry is looking at 550,000 pieces of evidence, which is a huge number to cover in a relatively short time span. Of course, within them will be some good detail, but alongside that will be a lot of noise and unnecessary detail there too.
But isn't it getting too far down in the weeds that what we really need to understand is the big issues? Why were we prepared for the wrong type of pandemic? What did we do that worked? What did we do that didn't work? Inevitably, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was limited information. People will have made mistakes. People have got some things right. But that's not really the point of the inquiry, is it?
No, certainly. I think the big interesting questions are those structural ones you allude to there. Really, how can we improve machinery of government? How can we make those processes effective? So when the next pandemic comes around, we don't make the same mistakes. It's not necessarily in the details of communications on WhatsApp, whether Johnson said something to Matt Hancock on a certain day or not, whether he said he should be injected with COVID on live TV. Of course, that's pretty immaterial to how the pandemic played out. And it's unnecessary detail, really, I think, for the inquiry to get into.
And why do you think we're taking so long? Because other countries, I think France as well as Sweden, have actually done their inquiries already. I don't think this inquiry will have finished taking evidence until 2026, with the report then to be written. We'll be in a completely different environment by the time it's finished.
I think the inquiry has become very politically charged, especially with Partygate and that issue adding quite a bit of political salience to the inquiry. Of course, the exact findings into the pandemic and what the UK could have improved in its response will be difficult for the government, and particularly Sunak, to navigate, especially given his role in the pandemic during the second wave, when he was the most staunch advocate within government against lockdown. But that really is the core of the issue, that it is quite a political process, and the inquiry wants to go into detail to make sure it gets it right. Of course, in that process...
But it is, as we were saying earlier, it's the big issues. Was Rishi Sunak as Chancellor right about the scale of furlough of the government support schemes to keep business going? Did that economically make sense? But that's not an issue that's dependent on WhatsApp messages and emails and all of that. That's a big economic decision that requires expert analysis from economists rather than gossipy emails.
Certainly, no, I quite agree. And I think it's got to be very difficult for the inquiry to not get lost in the fantastic detail, I'm sure, and there will be plenty of headlines that the messages could potentially create, as we saw earlier this year with Isabel Oakeshott's messages that played out in the Telegraph. There will be plenty of headlines, but it's trying to sort out what's the important facts of the pandemic, what lessons can we take away for the future, and what's just ephemeral Westminster gossip.
And so what do you think Lady Hallett's up to? Why does she want all these emails rather than focusing on what seems to be the obvious course for the inquiry, and indeed following one of the inquiry's remits to get on with it in a timely manner?
There will be some fantastic detail in there, no doubt, that helps the inquiry understand government decision processes. And of course, much government business, as you well know, is done over WhatsApp, is done in those messages between ministers in that forum. So I imagine for those reasons, she very much wants the messages, but also because there is a lot of interest in some of those early phases of the pandemic where there was so much chaos, where there was so much informal day-to-day contact, where decisions had to be taken in that way, and there was no other choice but to use WhatsApp for those.
But surely what matters is the decisions that were taken, not the process of taking them. That everybody was working with imperfect information at the beginning of the pandemic. And what matters is, were the decisions right, and how do we learn from that, rather than was the decision made at a formal cabinet meeting or on a WhatsApp message?
I think for the learnings of the inquiry to be replicable, we have to learn what processes worked as well as what decisions worked. Of course, the next pandemic, there's no guarantee it'll be like the last. There's no guarantee it'll affect the population in the same way, that it will be predominantly elderly people affected by the disease. So to really learn from that decision-making process, learn when does government get the decisions right, when does it get them wrong, and how does it get there, I think will be very important for the inquiry to find out.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond. It won't surprise viewers to know that I tend to send messages by semaphore rather than by WhatsApp, but therefore they won't be of interest to the inquiry. Anyway, remember, we want to hear your thoughts. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, how did a case of police brutality in Minneapolis become a point of controversy in Salford, of all places? And don't forget, send in your Wet Wipe of the Week nominations. It's probably going to be a very close call.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Lynn is outspoken. Rubbish! You know the government will fiddle with the messages so the truth will be covered up. It's for the inquiry team to decide what is relevant. Jeff, this COVID inquiry must be swift and deliver the facts, and we must learn. Move on and stop looking back. It does not help the psyche of the population to be dragged out. And Jake, the inquiry needs above all to be thorough. If the chairperson deems that, in order for it to be thorough, she needs access to the PM's WhatsApp messages, then so be it. Thank you for those. Keep on sending them in. This week, Salford City Council was berated by its own constituents after it posted a photo of its 4 chief council officers taking the knee to mark the anniversary of George Floyd's death. The photo was accompanied with a caption, "May he rest in peace. We will continue to push for a more inclusive society for all. May he, of course, rest in peace." Alas, the photo has since been removed from its Twitter account after the council said that it will not tolerate hate after members of the public reminded it that it had happened in the US, not Salford. The most controversial part of this debacle is that the council made its account private, completely blocking the public from seeing any of its posts. I understand the council has now reversed this, but it's a concern for constituents who pay the council tax and want to hear and say what the council is putting out. I'm delighted to be joined by my panel, journalist and former Conservative councillor Caroline Fisk, and the contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker. Michael, wasn't it always pretty ridiculous for UK politics to latch onto the very particular US circumstance of the death of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis?
Well, it wasn't something that was led by politicians, was it? So clearly there was a movement. There was someone who was killed in the United States, which created a really extraordinary large movement against racial injustice, and there were many people in this country who felt that they were subject to the same forms of discrimination, and so took inspiration from that movement and had it here.
Well, it was promoted by the Black Lives Matter group, which is, as you know, a hard left group that wants to defund the police and it has a whole range of basically Marxist views.
But what you saw both in America and in this country here is an extraordinary bottom-up explosion of people saying, we feel like we are not properly listened to, like we are stopped and searched by a disproportionate amount. I mean, we had the Casey review, for example, just a few months ago that said the police were institutionally racist. You had a Sikh police officer getting his beard cut as a joke, a Muslim police officer getting bacon put in his shoe. So this idea that racism is only a problem in America and we should sort of say, well, we're Britain, it's different.
We had the
I think that's a little bit silly.
report that actually said that we didn't have institutionalised racism in the UK. Caroline, what are your thoughts on Salford and taking the knee generally? Do you think it was a bottom-up activity, or was very much led by people like Keir Starmer, who took...
OK, so I would say, clearly, I would agree with you. I mean, you could see that in the beginning it was bottom-up. People were out on the streets. I think 3 years later, we're left with what I think is an empty gesture. It's no longer coming up from the street. It's council employees on large salaries, instructed by diversity officers to make a gesture which I think, well, we saw from the response, that no one appreciates. And they now think it's empty virtue signalling, which is a problem.
And council employees, unlike councillors, are meant to be apolitical. They're not meant to be putting themselves on one side of a political argument or another.
They're meant to be apolitical. And I think what I saw was behind the camera, the 2 full-time diversity officers, which are paid by Salford Council, and 20 comms staff. So, you know, that's sort of hundreds of thousands of salaries, which should be going to sort of tenants who've got damp in their properties, but which, you know, are sort of paid to come up with these daft ideas, which we know was daft because of the angry reaction. People are tired of it. They're tired of the virtue signalling.
The virtue signalling is something that councils shouldn't be using ratepayers' money for. They should get on with the job of filling potholes if ever they could be bothered.
Well, this is obviously, I come on this show because I like talking to people I disagree with. I find it sort of a productive thing to do. But sometimes when I get these stories, this is a tweet from some council officers of them posing in a picture. It wasn't that there isn't a hospital getting built or homes getting fixed because they spent 5 minutes doing a very simple gesture and tweeting it out. And this idea that no one appreciated it, everyone's really, really annoyed. I've tweeted all sorts of things and had very, very annoyed people under it. It's not a story which really warrants being on national television.
Everything I tweet annoys lots of people. Automatically, I think they only follow me to be annoyed. But I'm not doing it at the taxpayer's expense. I'm doing it at my own expense. That's the difference.
You're funded by the taxpayer as well, aren't you?
And I would also say...
Not for my tweets. It's my own telephone. I pay for the telephone.
So they'll put out endless tweets. The council will put out endless tweets. This one annoyed people. So it's right that they actually think, you know, well, why did this annoy people? And I think it is because people are annoyed by the empty virtue signalling. And it's not just a tweet. There are the 2 full-time diversity officers plus the 20 communications staff. That's thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds. Don't you think it should be spent on fixing damp?
Well, I think if we're talking about money to fix damp, the bigger issue is that council funding got cut by about 60% since 2010. So this seems to me a distraction, basically on all counts. Now, does Salford Council...
Whenever the left do something
then you should be annoyed by that.
It's a distraction.
Yeah.
Why don't they get their act together and not do it? And the fundamental point that council employees should not be political. That's for the councillors.
Well, so this is, I think, where we might disagree on what counts as political, right? So what you will have is you will have lots of supposedly neutral civil servants or accounts from various ministries, which are supposed to be neutral, which will tweet about, say, the coronation, you know, which I'm sure you and your audience think is fine. I might think is political. You'll get other council officers, people who work for the state, who say, we think Black Lives Matter, we think racism matters. Now, some of your audience might find that political. I think that seems like a more objective thing. So this idea of what's political and what's not is actually a bit more complicated than you're making out.
Caroline, don't you think clearly political because it's associated with the BLM movement, which is a political movement?
You know what, I think there are many different interpretations. So there are the people who follow politics closely and see it as a very politicised gesture. That's why I come back to this. I know we possibly overuse this term virtue signalling, but I think there's more people now who don't necessarily see it as very political but just see it as it's become very empty, very easy to do. You'd like them, the council employees, to be taking real issues, real racism, real problems, much more seriously, rather than using budget on what I consider to be rather empty-headed, virtue signalling towards political gesture.
But does Michael have a point that when it's something I like, it's apolitical, and when it's something he likes, it's apolitical in his view, but when it's something the other one of us doesn't like, then we say, oh, hold on, that's political.
Well,
is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, that's the eternal problem, isn't it? What is political? And so that's why I think I personally on this one focus on the virtue signalling. It doesn't achieve anything, and you've got to think about the cost behind it.
Michael, I'm going to give you the final word because I was paraphrasing your...
Well, no, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think maybe the difference between me and you, so I think when the civil service tweet about the monarchy, it's political. You think when they tweet about Black Lives Matter, it's political. But I don't think it matters that much. So I also have a YouTube show, and on that show, we talk about the fact that wages have been stagnating since 2008. We talk about the fact
we need a growth agenda.
A climate crisis is coming along. We need to build more houses. Yeah, I'm sure we disagree on how to create a growth agenda. But whether or not this civil servant tweeted this picture or that picture and some people got annoyed in the comments, it's not that big a deal.
I think I'm more austere than you are on public spending. Caroline?
Well, I do think it's a big deal when thousands of people are very annoyed.
We don't have evidence thousands of people are very... How many...
OK, I agree.
The article had about 4 comments.
It's a problem that they removed any evidence. But we've got to assume there are a lot of angry people, and you've got to think, why are ordinary people who pay the wages and pay their council tax, why are they getting annoyed?
Well, I mean, if they were very annoyed, they could elect a different council in Manchester. I think that's probably somewhat unlikely.
Annoyed because there are potholes all over Salford, which they're not filling in. Anyway, thank you to my panel. They'll be back after the break. Coming up, what happens when the horrors of modern art coincide with royal portraiture? And don't forget, keep sending in your wet wipe of the week nominations. They've been flooding in. We've got lots to choose from.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6.
We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jeremy, controversial this one. Michael is wrong. These issues do matter. They are elected representatives and should be scrutinised for associating with a Marxist group like BLM. Maria, the knee has become an empty gesture, like with the Premier League footballers who had very little to say about the racism in Qatar, but continued with their performative charade. Flanders and Swan understood the avant-garde in a song I'm sure you're all familiar with. I actually played it to my production team. It goes Peepo Belly Jaws. But the latest example of modern art would leave even them lost for words. In the postmodern world, beauty has become subjective, and subjectively, I think this is very ugly. What happens when the attention-seeking of modern art coincides with the traditions of royal portraiture? This monstrosity arises from the vasty deeps. This is a painting commissioned by the British Embassy in the United Arab Emirates, painted by artist Sasha Jaffrey. The artist claimed, with the expected modern artist's sincerity, that the painting stands for the unification of not only the UK and the UAE, but also the whole of humanity. It would be unkind and cynical to consider this a pretentious comment, which is why I'm delighted to be joined by the kind and generous royal historian, Rafe Hadel-Mankoo. Rafe, Charles I gave people portraits painted by Van Dyck. The embassy has given a portrait painted that looks pretty rotten. Is that fair, or am I being mean?
I think absolutely fair. You know, King Charles I, as our current king, was a great patron of the arts. Of course, the Royal Collection Trust, in large part, was started there. As you'll see on the wall behind me, you'll be able to see my own family portraits of various ancestors of mine. So you'll know that artistically, I rather favour more traditional, dare I say, conventional portraits. And when I first heard that a coronation portrait was being gifted to the ruling family in Dubai, I immediately thought, of Alan Ramsey's glorious portrait of King George III, or Luke Fildes' portrait of Edward VII, or even Annie Goni's celebrated portrait of Her Late Majesty. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw this explosion of pink pop art. And I immediately thought of Sir Winston Churchill's 80th birthday presentation at Westminster Hall. On November the 30th, 1954, the combined Houses of Parliament, Commons and Lords, assembled to present him with a portrait that they had commissioned from Graham Sutherland. And when the sheet came down and the portrait was seen by all, there was an audible gasp from the crowd there. And the Churchill was visibly hurt by the sickly greens and yellows and the hint of an undone fly button. But without missing a beat, he said, "The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art." And I think that applies in this case too.
Yes, it also seems an extraordinary muddle with sort of random hearts all over it. It struck me, I'm afraid, as a bit Rolf Harris, but perhaps that's too unkind.
Can you tell what it is yet? I don't think we can tell what it is yet. The king sort of sits in this portrait like a rock of stability, as the monarchy should do, around the chaos of the modern world. That's the best one can really say about it. And I've looked into this artist's other works, and I appreciate the intention was to show His Majesty's varied interests and beliefs. But to me, yes, this looks pretty much like sort of an end-of-term project by a second-year student in an art school. And several years ago, I was in Dubai, and I was honoured to be invited to the private office of Sheikh Mohammed, the ruler of Dubai. And when you go in there, you see a few portraits of these UAE royals, and they're notable for how distinguished they look and how they're pictured in very regal positions, designed to show their status. And all I could think of was how they would receive such a picture, particularly because if you look to the left of His Majesty's head, you'll see a couple of bare feet. Now, in Arab culture, showing the soles of one's feet is a sign of huge disrespect.
Oh dear, oh dear. Thank you, Rafe. That is, I think, the killer fact that we've discovered from Rafe this evening. But still with me and my panel, journalist and former Conservative councillor Caroline Fisk, and contributing to editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker. Caroline, it's hideous, isn't it?
No, I think that the killer fact that you're missing is that your king likes this artist. And in 2009, he actually commissioned Sasha Jeffrey to paint 19 portraits of very well-known Muslims from around the world for charity. And some of those portraits were of royal families from Dubai. And so it's actually a lovely gesture that originally Prince Charles commissioned.
Portraits are good doesn't mean that this one is.
It's in the style.
That doesn't follow.
No, it follows that this. OK, so King Charles likes the artist. He's previously commissioned the artist, and the original artworks back in 2009 were in exactly this style. So there's great humour coming from the British consul to commission the same artist now to do the reciprocal piece of work. King Charles will very much appreciate the humour, and so will the royal family.
Michael?
Rare outbreak of agreement on this sofa.
From me. And
I think it's quite an entertaining poster. It's not a poster, it's a painting, presumably.
But this is to a serious royal house. We shouldn't be giving some sort of cartoonish thing to a serious royal house.
Well, I mean, I suppose... I mean, this is a bit of a... I could have made this point any time in the last century, but I suppose, you know, the advance of cameras meant that you had to be a bit more creative when it comes to art. So the idea that you just sort of paint something that looks as much like King Charles as possible... King Charles, I got it right. King Charles as possible. And leave it there. You've got to be a bit more imaginative. I think it's a fairly fun piece.
But don't you want some magnificence in art? Some grandeur?
Yeah, you can see some grandeur in that. You know, you've got lots going on. I mean, it's modern.
Well,
don't you want the monarchy to come into the 21st century? I'm not so fussed, but some
modern,
people might be.
Modern, in my view, has always been a swear word. But moving on, it's been reported that at least 1 in 7 households that have someone of working age in them have 0 people working. And it's clear this is one of the many unfortunate casualties of lockdown. Prior to the pandemic, Britain's workforce was nearly fully mobilised. But as a result of the changes in the benefits and incentive system, it seems Britain is now stuck in a cycle of under- and unemployment. These new figures just released follow the Prime Minister's push to get the record 5.2 million Brits on out-of-work benefits back into the workforce. It may even help bring down record levels of migration. I mean, I'm more concerned about this, Caroline, not from the economic point of view, but from the point of view of the lives that aren't necessarily being fulfilled, that the opportunity that works give, the advantages that it gives to people being able to get out and do a job is pretty fundamental. And if 1 in 7 households have no one in work, that's pretty sad for them, isn't it?
Well, I think we need to really be careful about how we talk about this. There'll be some people where it is a terrible tragedy. And I think that mostly the people who were marginally working before the pandemic might have just been holding on to a job. They might have been helped into work by, say, a job scheme. The pandemic came along, they lost their work and they've never found their way back in. Businesses that shut down in small towns. So you've got the very tragic end of the spectrum. But I think at the other end, you've got to think that there's some people that look at the rate of taxation and regulation and think it's simply not worth working. And that's tragic too for the whole country.
And there's something the government can do about that
Yeah.
if the combination of tax and benefits is making people feel it's not worth working.
Right, and so I just looked back at what the government did in the recent budget, and there were 4 sort of bullet points on the government's website, and each of them was sort of finicky bits of spending. And what annoyed me, that they were all described as investment. And so talking about sort of not using your communications well, I think the government needs to be much more honest about how it describes its various schemes, talks honestly to us, and thinks about how that increase in spending in order to help these people is, of course, then raising taxes, decreasing work opportunities. So we need to take a much more structural and strategic approach to this problem.
Well, I absolutely agree with you on the misuse of the word investment, which has come to be a synonym for taxpayer money being spent. But, Michael, I assume you agree that this is a serious problem. How do you think you solve it? What would you suggest a government does to try and get people back into work?
Well, I mean, I suppose your point about work being a fulfilling thing to do, I mean, it really makes a difference what kind of work we're talking about, right? And that's why I think there's a real danger. I know Ian Duncan Smith was saying, we need much tougher sanctions. And the whole point of what tougher sanctions do is they say you have to take any possible job available, and you basically have to beg for any possible job available because you have to look for 35 hours a week or whatever it is. Now, what incentives does that give to employers to offer fulfilling work to people, right? So I think this idea that we just push people into whatever vacancy there is and sanction them if they don't comply is not the way that we're going to get a high-value, high-wage, high-skilled economy. It's the way that we are going to enable quite a lot of employers to offer terrible conditions and terrible pay.
Are you sure about that? Because the best way to get a job is from employment. The best way to get a promotion is from employment. And that therefore taking an entry-level job may be the way to break the cycle of dependency that Caroline was talking about.
Well, I mean, I think in many industries, my own as well, in journalism, actually, one of the reasons I was able to get into journalism is because I'm from a middle-class family and I didn't have to worry about money for a little while. So I didn't do internships, but, I could go get a master's. I could go do some voluntary writing on the side. I think the idea that the way to raise up the value chain, as it were, when it comes to work, is to get the first job you're offered and get it, with a gun to your head, because if you're getting sanctioned, that is, pretty disastrous, pretty catastrophic for lots of people. I don't think that is the way for people to find a valued and fulfilling career.
But, Caroline, isn't it fair to have sanctions when there are jobs available? That if there weren't any vacancies, it would be different. But there are plenty of vacancies. We're importing labour. Therefore, to say to the domestic workforce, if you don't take a job that is available, we're not going to carry on paying you benefits, seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable approach.
Yeah, I would say that if money grew on trees, of course we would want everybody to have wonderful jobs. But when you're in a situation that it doesn't, you effectively have to say to people, you can't stay on benefits for life. You need to take what work's available. And from there, hopefully, as you said, you go on up. You're motivated, you're in work. Maybe you think, I don't like this, but I'll try something else. Or else there'll be training in that workplace. Well, so it's absolutely right and proper that you get people in there.
We haven't quite got so much agreement on the panel on this, but thank you to my panel. After the break, we'll be joined by cricket legend Pat Pocock after a joyous first day of the England-Ireland Test match, uninterrupted by the Eco-Loons. And don't forget, the results are coming in. We will be announcing the winner of Wet Wipe of the Week shortly.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts of
Moss?
rumors. Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Bob says, I don't know what the portrait means, but I think it's quite pretty. Jeremy, when beauty becomes subjective, civilization comes to an end. That's wonderfully pithy. That should be in the dictionary of quotations. And James, we need Ian Duncan-Smith in government sorting the unemployment issue. Well, I agree with that. So it's now an opportunity with Pat Pocock to talk about the cricket. The score at the end of the day, Ireland was 172 all out. Broad got 5 for 51, and Leach, Somerset player, great hero, 3 for 35. And those of you who are used to cricket following normal patterns would be surprised that a spin bowler came on before lunch. England then scored 152 for 1 after 25 overs, scoring at 6 runs and over. Duckett not out 60 at the end of the day's play. So for those of us who were there, and I was lucky enough to be there, as was Nigel Farage, it was a really good day's cricket, and who better to talk to me about it than England cricket legend Pat Pocock. It's a good day for England, and scoring fast, setting extraordinary fields for some of the day, clearly is working.
Yes, they were. It's very nice to see Ireland here. I think it's the 7th match they played, and it was. It's lovely to see them coming into Test cricket, which is very important. But I felt a little bit sorry for them, even though I want to see England do really well, because to lose the toss and to go out there when there's no sun and the wicket's going a bit all over the place, and then in the afternoon we saw what happened when the sun came out and it calmed down a lot, and the bowlers bowled very, very well. But it takes a lot, and we've had some very good Irish players playing in our cricket, and they've done very well, and I think they've probably taken the successes back home with them.
Yes, but you're quite right. The morning was very overcast, and it was a good toss to win, though the tradition of always electing to bat has gone, hasn't it? That captains are much more likely now to opt to field if they think the conditions will help them for an early wicket or two.
Yes, they will, but it's very important to have the Test cricket because Test cricket is the skeleton of cricket, and the county cricket is the skeleton of Test cricket for lots of reasons. You cannot build a membership to start off with around the T20, and yet the T20 has given cricket a golden goose, the second golden goose, and they've done very well with it, and it's a great series. And Owen Morgan was a magnificent player in the T20, but he learnt his cricket playing in the county side.
And of course was Irish, is Irish.
Very much
Actually,
so.
he rang the bell at Lord's today.
Very much so, yeah. Fine player.
But it's wonderful that Test cricket's become exciting again, because I'm sure you've spent some days, probably at the Oval rather more than Lord's in your case, when you get about 240 runs during the day and not many wickets, and you've got another 4 days to go, and you think, why am I sitting here all day? When you get Test teams scoring at 6 runs and over, it's really good entertainment as well as being good cricket, and that must be beneficial for the game.
It is beneficial, and one of the great things for the public as well as the team is when spinners are bowling well. I've been on a tour where Phil Edmonds and I bowled all day, every day, and people came up to us, very knowledgeable people in the evening, and said, today was a marvellous day's cricket, one of the best days I've seen for a long time. I said, really? Why was that? It seemed like an ordinary day. Well, because we saw a couple of good spinners bowling at quality batsmen throughout the day. So when you don't have the spinners, not only does the team not get the wickets, but the people on the perimeter don't see what many people regard as the most exciting part of the game.
Well, and also the spinners get through the overs.
Much faster.
A high over rate, again, as you're on the edge of your seat. That was the only drawback today. The first hour, we only had 12 overs.
Yes.
That's a bit disappointing.
Yes, unfortunately, the over rate is not where they judge the day's play by. The day's play, that everybody will say, well, England's had a good day, and we felt a bit sorry for Ireland, but I'm sure, you know, it's they've got a long way to go.
Yes, and it bodes well for the Ashes.
Yes, I mean, that is especially Ashes at Lords. If you speak to most of the Australians, they will say that is the pinnacle, playing an Ashes match at Lords. But going back to today's play, I felt a little bit sorry for the Irish people, because if you haven't played at Lords before, the slope on the pitch, if you talk to any of the former Middlesex players, they will all tell you that many batsmen are affected by the slope on the pitch. They play a little bit inside the line because it's going. They think it's going away from them. So the slope on the pitch does actually help until you get used to it. And
of course, the English players have the home advantage, and they have the crowd behind them. The crowd at Lords is very restrained compared to some other grounds.
Oh yes, very much so. And it makes a lot of difference if the pitch is very, very pale, as opposed to it had a little bit of colour in it. And it seems to, as soon as the sun comes out, I noticed this afternoon the ball wasn't coming through on such varying height, and the varying height is a big part of the game.
And Jack Leach, very important part he played, coming on to bowl before lunch, well, quite a long time before lunch. I mean, I don't imagine you did that very often in your career.
No, but Jack's a fine bowler. And he did a very, very good job. But you have to bowl in a slightly different way when you're bowling on this sort of wicket, as opposed to a turning wicket. But,
and with a newish ball.
And with a newish ball, yes. I still find it very difficult when walking back, he's spinning, and I tried like mad to look after my finger as much as I could, because I ripped it open. So, so when Jack's standing there going like that, I think, crikey, Jack. I tried to restrict it to when I was bowling.
Yes. Well, I was extremely pleased to see such a success by a Somerset man, which is my sort of big interest in cricket, hoping that one day Somerset will win the county championship. But Pat, thank you for coming back. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
And now, everyone, before we hand over to the professor of Phil and Holly studies himself, it's time for the moment you've been waiting for. It's Wet Wipe of the Week, and I've got a packet of wet wipes that are unbranded, and we've had some nominations. So John says, how about the UK Health Security Agency, a.k.a. Nanny State? Humans getting hot in hot weather? Well, who'd have thought it? That's a very good recommendation, and we might talk about that another day. Gordon, Wet Wipe of the Week goes to Philip Schofield. Who's he? We'd better ask the professor about that in a moment. The man is just unbelievable, and not in a good way. And Andy, you've got the winner, would like to nominate the city of Salford Council as a bastion of left-wing foolery. He had the misfortune to work for it from 1990 to 1997. So here's the Wet Wipe of the Week awarded to Salford. Councillors, they're 3,860 miles away from Minneapolis, where the death of George Floyd took place. But it seems that none of our viewers could understand why that had happened. They thought it deserved the Wet Wipe of the Week. So Salford Council, you've got a prize, but not perhaps the prize that you really wanted. Now, that's all from me for this week, but up next is Professor Daniel Wootton. Professor, what have you got in store tonight?
Well, goodness me, my wet wipe of the week would certainly be Philip Schofield, and there are big developments on that tonight, Jacob. So we have actually tracked down ITV's This Morning editor, Martin Frizzell, and we'll tell you what he has to say about whether there was some sort of a cover-up over this Schofield scandal. As well as that, Carol McGiffin tonight, live on the show, is going to become the first loose woman to speak out about exactly what went on. And remember, there's a real connection with the show Loose Women to what happened, because Philip Schofield's young runner lover was actually moved from working on This Morning to the Loose Women show. So Carol McGifford, as I say, is going to be the first star of the show to really lift the lid on what went on behind the scenes. And let me tell you, she's got a few bombshells to come, Jacob.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating, and I really do think our viewers are extremely lucky to have you to explain it all to them, because I don't think anybody in the country understands it as well as you do, and I certainly knew nothing about it a fortnight ago and now feel much, much better informed. But that's all from me for this week. It's been delightful to have you joining me all this week. We will be going momentarily to the weather, where I can be pretty confident that the sun will be shining in Somerset, but actually tomorrow I'm back at Lord's, where I hope England continue to do so well. So the weather in Marylebone, I hope, is sunny too.
Evening, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Today marks the start of meteorological summer, and for many, the sun will continue to shine. It should be a brighter day tomorrow across parts of eastern England compared to today. The weather's set fair thanks to this big area of high pressure. Around that high, the breeze is still feeding in from the North Sea, and that moves the cloud back inland during this evening and overnight, so turning overcast across most of England into parts of East Wales, southern Scotland as well. Extreme west, Northern Ireland, and a good chunk of Scotland will stay largely clear. And here it will turn quite chilly. Northern Scotland, even a touch of frost is possible, but most will start Friday at about 8 or 9 Celsius, but also starting fairly cloudy. Now, I think that cloud will break up as we go through Friday morning, reasonably quickly as well, and I'm more optimistic that eastern counties of England, where it has been dull and cold all week, will be a little bit brighter. There will still be a breeze, bringing a chilly feel from the North Sea. So